Good morning and welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for community and faith partners. In today's program, we welcome the SF Planning Department, who will shine a light on the expanding housing choice Housing Element Rezoning Program. A special thanks, the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing is supported by a grant from the San Francisco Foundation. Thank you. The important and ongoing work of the San Francisco Interfaith Council would not be possible without generous funding from congregations, corporations, faith-based social service agencies, foundations, judicatories, and supporters like you. Help us spread the word. Visit sfinterfaithcouncil.org to learn about SFIC programming and how to become a supporter. Follow SFIC on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to SFIC's YouTube channel to watch all of our virtual events. A bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, all participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. To submit a question or comment, select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to Q&A. Questions will be forwarded to the host and answered time permitting. For closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this week's online briefing for community and faith partners. Building upon the recent Ministry of Housing online series, this week's SFIC online briefing for community and faith partners is supported by a generous grant from the San Francisco Foundation. And it will feature a presentation by the San Francisco Planning Department on the topic of expanded housing choice, the Housing Element Rezoning Program, a state-mandated implementation action identified in the 2022 Housing Element, which charts a course for San Francisco's plan to meet its housing needs for the next 8 years. The presentation will share background on the project, our city's housing needs, community engagement, and an overview of how the zoning proposal will enable additional housing production in state-designated housing opportunity areas in the western and northern neighborhoods of San Francisco. The team will also share this rezoning intersects, how this rezoning intersects with strategies to support the development of affordable housing on institutional and religious sites. At this time, as we do at the beginning of each of these briefings, allow me to share our interfaith statement. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other, that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. We are very blessed to have with us today Pastor Odette Lockwood Stewart, the pastor of Park Presidio United Methodist Church. She is no stranger to the Bay Area, as she served here for many, many years before being called to Paris to minister to the expats, but was called back here in order to repurpose the property at Park Presidio United Methodist Church for affordable housing. I have met few people that are as passionate or knowledgeable about housing as Pastor Odette, and so by intention, we invited her today to offer this reflective moment and to ground us. Pastor Odette, it is great to have you with us. Thank you for the contribution you're about to make, and thank you for enriching our interfaith mosaic here in San Francisco.
Thank you, Michael, and for that very generous introduction. On June 19th, 1865, 2½ years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, Union soldiers finally brought word to Galveston, Texas, that enslaved Texans were freed. This week, 159 years and 1 day later, we celebrate Juneteenth. In 2021, Juneteenth became a U.S. national holiday. This is a holiday to honor African-American history and culture, to honor the full history of our nation, to celebrate freedom from slavery in all its forms, to work to repair generations of harm, and to recommit ourselves to dismantling racism and injustice in policies of every kind and practice. Last week, also, a dear personal friend and colleague and inspiration to me passed away. The Reverend James Morris Lawson Jr. died at the age of 95. He was a United Methodist pastor, a prophet, a nonviolent activist. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called Jim Lawson the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world. Dr. King urged Lawson to put the spiritual practices of nonviolence into action in the American South. So he led workshops in church basements in Nashville, Tennessee. He prepared the Freedom Riders and trained hundreds and hundreds of students who sat in at lunch counters in Nashville, which became the first major city in the United States to desegregate its downtown. In 1968, Jim was the chief strategist for the Memphis sanitation worker strike, which Dr. King came down to visit, support, lend his aid, and then later was shot and killed at the Lorraine Motel. Jim Lawson never accepted that James Earl Ray was the lone assassin and visited him in prison for years and even performed his marriage ceremony. His death is a great loss, but comfort is in that he trained and touched as a true light thousands and thousands who can now carry on his legacy. Our two texts for these brief moments. The first is Philippians chapter 2, verses 4-6, known to be the earliest writings about Jesus, how he lived and how he used power. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you as was in Jesus Christ, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped. And then from the prophet Isaiah, the 5th chapter, 8th verse. Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field, till no space is left and you live alone in the land. I'm so thrilled with this presentation today, and I call us out of all of our traditions to be engaged with one another and with the city and the planning department to reaffirm that housing is a verb, housing is a right, housing is an essential and intersectional public health priority. Land use and housing is a constant theme in the Christian scriptures, rooted in the commandments to love God with everything we are and have, and to love each other, our neighbor, as we love ourselves. As communities of faith, the creativity and multiplicity of God in community helps us build community and connection for the flourishing of housing that in process and outcome is sustainable, just, empowering, beautiful, life and health giving. We need to build communities, not just housing. When our community issued its RFQ, RFP, the one question we got from consultants and city leaders and also our developers was, what do you mean by community? So as the San Francisco Interfaith Council and Communities, let us engage in lively conversation about what exactly that looks like in San Francisco. And the moral, political, imagination, and authority with constant and critical theological reflection can be an exciting adventure for us all. Let us pray. Gracious and ever-loving God, you invite us to participate in new creation. Help us to listen deeply, to learn, and to reimagine what we might do together to welcome all your people home. We give thanks for the promise of yes in God's backyard and pray for the fulfillment of that promise in this city of St. Francis. May all your people have safe, sustainable, just, affordable housing in this city. I pray in the name and in the way of Jesus, honoring your many names. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Pastor Odette. I had not read that piece from Isaiah, but I think we're going to make it the moniker of our work. When I sit in my office, I have this rather large map from the planning department that has 800 dots on it. And those are the parcels owned by religious institutions in San Francisco. I think what distinguishes our work in this field is that we bring a morality of housing and the right to housing as part of the narrative. And so it really is walking the walk and making San Francisco a better place. Thank you for your contributions. I know that they're tireless, and I consider you a partner in our work. God bless you and God keep you. Well, today we are going to talk about those 82,000 new units that San Francisco needs to build from 2023 for the next 8 years. And we are very blessed to have with us 2 members of the San Francisco Planning Department that are involved with the Expanding Housing Choice Project. The principal and project manager, Lisa Chen, and David Garcia, who is a planner on this project as well. Their bios are in the program announcement, so I won't read them because we want to give them the time to really focus in on their presentation today. I would just encourage you all who are in the viewing audience to please listen in a way that you can ask questions. We ask that you send your questions to Q&A, and we will take time to get to as many of them as time will permit. So Lisa and David, the floor is yours. You've got the next 20 to 30 minutes to enlighten us and to engage us and to inform us. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Director Papas, and thank you as special thanks to Pastor Odette for the wonderful introduction. We greatly appreciate being welcomed to such an intentional space that focuses on meeting all of our community's needs in San Francisco, and particularly recognizing housing as one of those key needs. So with that, I'll start walking us through the presentation for this morning. So today we'll begin by speaking more about our community's housing needs and a bit more about the history, not only of our history of housing in San Francisco, but also what's behind this push to really do much more with housing than we have over the past few decades. So then we'll get into what that leads to, which is our housing element rezoning and our project Expanding Housing Choice. And we'll close by speaking more on sites analysis for affordable housing, particularly how we can work with religious and nonprofit partners to continue to further that work. And you'll see this graphic that we have here is part of the voices that we've heard from our community that we continue to ground our work in. Families who, whether their own children aren't able to stay in their communities is really something that we've been hearing throughout. And this is something that we always begin our presentations with is the experiences of people who live in San Francisco and who are challenged by the availability and affordability crisis that we see all around us. So people who are teachers and don't see their colleagues being able to stay in the city, or their students. We see our first responders who can't afford to live in San Francisco and the impacts that that has, and the people who actually build the housing being unable to find their own foot in the communities that they serve. So all of these communities are part of the thousands of voices that have been part of this process throughout, and the needs that we're trying to fulfill through our work, big picture. So we have, I think we all know that housing is a great need, and these are just some very high-level statistics that really drill these points down. So San Francisco home prices have doubled over the past 10 years and tripled over the last 20. Many of our households are what we consider as high rent burdened, which means that people are paying more than 1/3 of their income on rent. So that just strains everything. We know that when most of your income is going to rent, covering things that are for the health of your community or for the health of your family are going to get put on the back burner. So resources that we have for affordable housing are continuing to be strained, and the supply that we have is much below the need. So for example, in the Outer Sunset, we have currently built only 45 units, and we're glad to see that growing, but still for those units, we had over or thousands of applications for them. So each of our neighborhoods is feeling this in different ways, and we chose to highlight the Outer Sunset as one of the key communities that is in the geography that we're working in. So all of this current situation is really rooted in a larger legacy of how housing has been used to more than bring us together, often to separate us and separate different groups. And this has a very long and complicated history, but we want to really highlight that communities have been faced with these issues, whether it's the Black community and folks like the late Willie Mays, who we recognize, how he was, even though his great role in our community, he was kept from buying a house because of the color of his skin, or teachers such as this one highlighted here, who was recognizing how racial segregation was part of how where people were able to live in San Francisco. We also know that communities have been affected by urban renewal, and that this continued impacts of housing discrimination, whether it's redlining, are continued to be felt today in the issues that people face, where people are able to live, and the settlement patterns in the city. So while this history is definitely troubling, it is also empowering to what we're trying to do to address this history of discrimination. So as we see this today in our map highlighted here in blue, these are neighborhoods that are designated by the state as high or well-resourced neighborhoods, which means that they have greater access to parks, to high-quality schools, to less environmental burdens. And we see this is very much concentrated on the western and northern parts of the city. Unfortunately, these are the same communities that have not been building housing. So over the past, or since 2005, only 10% of new housing and 10% of new affordable housing has been built in these areas. Whereas we look in the map that shows where most housing has been concentrated, it's been concentrated on the on the eastern side of the city. And that mismatch is part of what we're trying to change. We're trying to push for more housing to be built across the city, and particularly in these areas that have more access to high opportunities and other resources that we just named. So as a state, we've identified this issue happening not only in San Francisco and not only in large cities, but in all cities. And the state of California is working very hard to really increase the expectations and what they hope that every city does to meet our statewide housing affordability and housing access crisis. So whether it's increasing their authority and enforcement and making sure that that cities really do follow up with their plan, and also calling us to increase the amount of housing that we build. So you might have heard a term RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and Director Pappas mentioned the 82,000 units. So that's exactly what our RHNA allocation for the city of San Francisco is. And it's not only about building 82,000 units, but it's also affirmatively furthering fair housing to making sure that, as we saw on the previous map, that the housing that we do build is not only concentrated in certain areas, but really in areas that do have access to resources. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're meeting our RHNA for these next 8 years. And there is a gap that leads us to create more capacity through what we call rezoning, or increasing the densities and what we're able to build in more parts of the city. So with that, looking at this, the housing element, which you all may have heard of, that was ratified last year, is a series of almost 360 or more than 360 actions. And under the directive from Mayor Lyndon Breed, Housing for All, we were directed as a city and all city agencies to implement this plan. So these are 4 very large implementation areas that are focused on meeting all of these different needs and actions to do so. And ours is this first one, expanding housing choice, where we're focused on adding housing close to transit and other services. And we're looking to get ahead of our deadline of January 2026. And we've been working on this for the past few years. We also have work on affordable housing funding and strategies. We have colleagues on the call also representing that work to coordinate all the different pieces that go into affordable housing from government, private, and philanthropic actors. Also, our work that centers community priorities and community needs, led by our community equity division here at the San Francisco Planning Department, and working with our cultural districts. And finally, housing production and process improvements. So this is simplifying the process to reduce the overall cost of housing. So we're going to focus mostly on this first bucket, but also knowing that a lot of these things are intersect with a lot of these different sections. So to do this work, we've really focused on and leaned on our community partners who work hand in hand with community members who are really at the who are really need or feel the pressures of housing and see it play out in their communities in ways firsthand from other work that they're doing, whether it's related to housing or related to youth services or meeting other community needs. So for this, we focused on creating housing education workshops. We also worked with holding focus groups with different communities across the city in language, and also have been holding community conversations with different community groups and leveraging our past efforts and relationships with our cultural districts and with other planning efforts that have gone on, including for the housing element. You might have also seen our graphics around the city that have announced our work, whether it was these ads on Muni buses or in the paper to share announcements about our open houses. And this is all, again, as I mentioned earlier, these are actual quotes that we got from community members that we worked with an artist at the Human Rights Commission to give that even more of a way to connect with people through art. So these were around the city in many different ways, and this was all part of a larger engagement strategy that included large open houses, open for the public, but also different strategies like the focus groups I mentioned that are definitely geared towards community, towards specific communities. We also had surveys and webinars and other presentations, whether it was to the Planning Commission or the Youth Commission, and with other specific groups depending on the topic. So with that, I wanted to hand it off to Lisa Chen to discuss a little bit about where we landed and how this is continuing to evolve.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you so much to the Interfaith Council and Director Pappas and Trey for welcoming us into your community. I think we're really excited to speak with all of you in particular because, as Director Pappas noted, of this mission, the shared mission we have of being an inclusive community and building housing that we need to make sure that current and future generations can thrive in the city. So as David noted, we have been doing a wide range of outreach. We've talked to thousands of people at this point, and at kind of the directive we were given by the mayor's office was to have kind of the first cut, the first draft, the draft proposal to her office by the beginning of this year. And so kind of at the end of our year-long outreach effort, which is ongoing, we submitted this proposal to her office, which, if you were tracking the housing element, some of these ideas were very much embedded in that planning process as well. But basically, we've kind of iterated over the year and landed at this draft. And for those of you who haven't seen it, just to orient you, again, this dotted line is really showing, the boundary for what the state considers the well-resourced neighborhoods. And so our proposal is, almost entirely concentrated within that in order to meet our goals of becoming, of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we're primarily concentrated on the transit corridors and commercial streets, and then other major sites. So that could be larger sites, so things like shopping malls. Actually, for this audience in particular, you'll notice on the bottom left, Brotherhood Way, there's a number of religious institutions there as well. And the brunt of the thrust of the plan is really about mid-rise housing. So we define that as 6 to 8 stories. So that's kind of what we have heard from the development community as a very effective and efficient way of building housing, because when you get higher than 85 feet, you introduce high-rise construction and other kind of more costly construction types, and that really brings the cost of that housing up. But at mid-rise, you're kind of getting that economy of scale where you're building, housing, multifamily housing, kind of just at that point before you reach high-rise. There are a few nodes that you'll notice in kind of darker red, and those are kind of the places where we're considering high-rise, so 140, 240, or 300 feet. And then off of the corridors, we are still continuing to look in the residential areas for places that we can add, housing without changing the building envelope. So adding more units, for example, but keeping the existing height limits, which are often 40 feet. That's kind of the prevailing height in most districts. Next slide. We can get more into next steps later on and our timeline as we reach adoption, but we do like to remind people just why we're doing this and that we have to do it. We've talked a lot about the history and the data and really what has driven our housing crisis. And I think what we have seen, and as David alluded to, we have seen the state really coalesce around asking all communities to do their part, to be more inclusive and to build housing to address our affordable housing crisis. And so there are stronger penalties around the state if we don't pass a rezoning that meets state requirements. And so kind of the first most direct consequence is that we could become ineligible for a range of state funds, including for transportation, affordable housing, and other infrastructure. We could also be subject to fines and lawsuits for being out of compliance with our housing element. And then the third is that we could lose local permitting control. So that's the so-called builder's remedy that you may have heard of, where essentially, if we aren't able to create the capacity we need through rezoning, and the state could force us to approve any housing projects that meet basic safety standards, even if they exceed our current zoning. Next slide. I think some part of our work really is about talking with people about change and helping them understand what that change could look like, and really kind of working with people to accept the idea that we need to build more housing in our community. And I really appreciated Pastor Odette's comments, and particularly this idea that we need to build community, not just housing. And so, part of our narrative has been about bringing in, voices of people who need housing. We also try to highlight, the areas that have built more housing and some of the changes they have seen. We have seen in other areas where we have built more housing that change does not happen overnight. It is incremental. So not every parcel that gets rezoned is going to turn into housing. Some, for some may never change. Some it may take years or decades to change. And then we'd just like to remind people all the benefits that new housing can bring. So, the number one goal really is about diversity and affordability of housing. And we have seen other communities that have been building a lot of housing experience some of these benefits, places like Sacramento, where they're building, more housing than any community in the state, it seems. They're starting to see rents stabilize. They're seeing kind of, even though people are moving to the region in ever greater numbers, they are seeing some of these benefits as they build housing. There's also, of course, economic benefits, in terms of supporting local businesses by bringing in more customers, increasing our funding and our taxes to serve infrastructure and other needs. And then, of course, our environmental and climate benefits, and really thinking about this imperative we have to think about how our living patterns and our housing contributes to the climate crisis. Next slide. We also like to show a lot of images of, what housing looks like, reminding people that in many of these neighborhoods, we already do have housing at these scales. So these are mid-rise and higher buildings that were built well before our current zoning. Our current zoning in many of these neighborhoods only allows, very low density development. So these are all apartment buildings from the early 1900s. Next slide. And then, showing people of what this can look like today. And, some of these examples are in the areas that are planned for housing, more housing. Some are in other areas of the city, but just showing, kind of the range of housing types that we can expect. And just the bottom two images of that are affordable housing. So also highlighting that. Next slide. And then here are some images that we've been working with a consultant on developing, and these are meant to kind of mock up not specific buildings. So we tried to make the architecture a little bit less, distinctive, but just kind of giving people an idea of the massing that, we'll start to see on these corridors. So this is Noriega and 25th Avenue. I used to live just a few blocks from here. If you know this street, that's a lot that's been empty for many, many years. So this is showing 8 stories. Next slide. And here's Geary and 4th Avenue showing a mix of 85 and 140-foot buildings. Oh, sorry, I thought there was another, but those were the 2. And I think just another thing I would say is that there's been a lot of narratives out there about fear of housing, and I'm looking forward to hearing during the Q&A from all of you about kind of how people in your community view adding housing in these neighborhoods, and maybe how we can flip that script a little bit, so that it's not fear of height, fear of the people that we assume will live in this housing, whether it's affordable housing or mixed income or market rate housing, but how it is about, building housings to support our communities, right? And from a policy level, we've been talking through a lot of policy ideas that we can implement along with the rezoning to acknowledge that, this is a change for many of these communities. These are places that have traditionally excluded new housing and that haven't seen a lot of growth over many decades. And so some of those kind of policy strategies include things like objective design standards, which are really creating very clear rules for developers so that as we add new housing, it's kind of in keeping with the spirit of the neighborhood, and really adds vibrancy. As this example, I love this example from the Tenderloin. This is an affordable housing project, and it isn't very new architecture, but you can see how it plays so nicely with the building next to it, which is many decades older. And just we can do a lot from just our rules to make that happen. We're also looking at historic and cultural preservation rules so that we're building new housing that is rooted in our past as well, and thinking about what are the specific cultural and historic and architectural features that we want to make sure that we maintain in our neighborhoods. We're also working with the Office of Small Business to really make sure that we're connecting to all the various programs and resources, so that if there are small businesses on these corridors that we can support through this transition, that they have all the resources that they need. And then in particular, working with the Mayor's Office of Housing and other agencies around our inclusionary housing policies and our tenant protections to make sure that existing tenants in these neighborhoods are also protected. Next slide. So that's kind of our rezoning. We did want to pivot just for the last couple slides, specifically to talk about sites for affordable housing. So David mentioned, we've been forming up some work with the Mayor's Office of Housing, really to fulfill our goal of, building more affordable housing. And in particular, making sure that we build more housing on the west side of the city. David mentioned, for example, in the Sunset District, there's only 45 affordable housing units and over 4,000 people applied for them, right? And you can see how this map really mirrors where housing production has happened in general, where a lot of it is in the southeast part of the city and the center part of the city, and there's very little affordable housing on the western and southern and northern parts of the city. So the scope of work that David is developing, I also saw we have James Pappas from our team here who's co-leading this work. But basically we're working very closely with the Mayor's Office of Housing to help identify potential sites for affordable housing citywide. So both in the well-resourced areas and outside of those areas. But then also thinking about strategically what makes sense for acquiring sites. We actually have thousands of sites that are existing housing projects that are waiting for funding in order to be developed. And so it's this kind of dance of, we have a certain amount of funding for affordable housing. How much do we place into getting those projects that are in the pipeline funded and implemented versus, using some of that money to acquire sites. So kind of the very beginning part of the pipeline. So we're going to be working with some consultants to do kind of a best practices study, looking at other cities that have grappled with this question of acquiring sites. We're also going to be talking, with folks in the land development and housing development space to figure out what makes sense in terms of the timing of acquiring sites. And as part of that, we'll also just be kind of sharing more information about our affordable housing pipeline, because we've also just found that there's a lot of questions and a lot of, misunderstanding about our pipeline itself. Next slide. And then in terms of, kind of this space that you've generously opened to us, we did want to highlight kind of opportunities for discussion going forward. So this is kind of our call to action slide. And so, there are, at the state level, a number of programs that are really incentivizing affordable housing, including SB4. You're probably all familiar with that. That's the YIGBY, Yes in God's Backyard bill that was adopted last year. But there are, a number of other kind of state streamlining and housing production bills that institutions could leverage to build affordable and mixed income housing. We do, of course, also really value this partnership, and we look forward to kind of continued discussions on how we can support your community. So, for example, as part of this sites analysis that we're working on, we'd love to hear from you on how we can engage with you and learn more about the challenges and opportunities specifically on religious sites. We're also kind of looking at different case studies. Here's one example at St. Mark's Square that, is under consideration right now. So I think, and as Pastor Odette, kind of mentioned, the work with her congregation, I think as we start to see more of these examples, hopefully they'll catch on and it will become, this trend that we see more broadly. And I think we can learn from these case studies to inform future work. And then, of course, I think it's on all of us, in this community and as a community more broadly, to continue to advocate for more resources for affordable housing. The city has been really ahead of the curve in the region and in the state for raising funding and building affordable housing, but we need to do more and we need to broaden it. So the BAFA bond is a great example of that. This regional bond that's going to be on the ballot this year. And that would be transformative in terms of a number of resources that it would raise for the region. So for the rezoning, we submitted our proposal to the mayor, and over the next several months, we're going to be continuing to do outreach. The mayor submitted a letter to the Planning Commission and the Planning Department directing us on next steps. So we have a lot of work on our plate to incorporate that feedback and to continue to speak with various communities to refine the draft zoning proposal. So the best way to keep updated on our progress is to sign up for our email list. So we can put that our project website on the chat so that you can see where to sign up for that. You can also email us directly if you have any feedback or questions. And then if any of you are actually interested in kind of pursuing the next steps with your site and looking at what that could be, we're happy to connect you with other folks within our department. And then there are going to be, future informational and adoption hearings at the Planning Commission and at the Board of Supervisors. So, we want to make sure that this is a really broad conversation that the policymakers are hearing around the need for housing and about our ability as a city to, become a more inclusive city. So with that, I think that was the last slide. And actually here is our project website for you to sign up for updates. And thank you again. We're looking forward to the questions.
Lisa, David, this presentation exceeded expectations. Thank you so very much. I don't know if you know this, but our work in this arena began in 2015 when faith leaders gathered and said, you know, we can't be part of the whining majority. We're sitting on some of the most valuable and underutilized property in San Francisco. Some of this property is tired and could use upgrades, and so it could be a win-win because some of the congregations are struggling as well. So our interest is sincere, and we appreciate the urgency, and we want to be good partners with the city. I know that the daunting number of 82,000 has kind of woken the city up, if you will, to the urgency of the need. And I just want to say a very special thank you to Supervisor Melgar, as well as Rich Hillis and Julian Banyalis. They've been amazing partners and have encouraged our work and our partnership. We have received a flurry of questions, and so I would like to get to them if that's possible. Let us begin. Hold on. Stick with me for just a moment. I want to do them in the order that they were given, that they were received. So we've got from James Fagler, hold on, who says, with the lessening number of percentage of affordable housing requirements and state density bonus incentives, has the San Francisco Planning Department seen a substantial increase in proposed housing projects and entitlement requests?
I felt like that was like combining a couple questions. One was kind of
parse them out.
Yeah, one was kind of about the impact of the state density bonus and the various bonus programs. And then another was kind of just about our pipeline. So you may have seen in the news, our pipeline has actually gone way down in recent years, or in the past couple years, in part because of, you know, just broader economic conditions. So, you know, high interest rates, and then, you know, the cost of doing business in San Francisco continues to rise. So construction costs are very high. They're, you know, consistently some of the highest in the country. And so that just makes it very challenging for a lot of projects to quote unquote pencil. You know, the state density bonus programs have been helpful in a lot of ways because they provide an additional incentive for projects to build by providing more height and density in exchange for providing higher affordable housing. So the state program, kind of the baseline program, like pre-2023 or 2024, was that you know, you could build up to 20% affordable housing, and then you got a certain amount of height kind of scaled based on that. And then this year, what came into effect is AB 1287, which added an additional bonus if you provide what we consider to be middle income housing. So housing that's in the 80% to 100 to 20% of our median income, our area median income. So because of that, we are starting to see more projects come in and propose even additional affordability in exchange for higher heights. So, you know, every year there's dozens of state bills. Last year, I think there were 60 housing bills. So we're, you know, all looking very closely to see what happens this year, because I think there's going to be continued programs like that are really aimed at bringing more affordability into our communities.
I didn't read the rest of the question, and it is, what is required from the San Francisco Planning Department to meet the state January 2026 deadline?
Yeah, so that the gap in our arena that David showed is 36,000 housing units. So that's basically, you know, we took our 82,000 units and then we subtracted, you know, the parts of our pipeline that we were allowed to count, which, you know, we could say that, you know, there's a reasonable chance this housing will get developed within the next 8 years. So after we subtract that, that gets us to the 36,000 units. And so our requirement is that we create capacity and change our zoning to allow for that housing by January 2026. So that means adopted by the commission, adopted by the board, signed by the mayor by that date. the state knows we don't actually build the housing ourselves. So, our responsibility is to create the capacity for it, but some of it is out of our control because it's the private market, right? That's the private market. And, in the case of affordable housing, it's having the sites and having the funding to build it.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and ask the question, with the budget pressures as they are, how has that impacted your work to be able to get to this 82,000 or 36,000?
Yeah. So, the budget hasn't impacted our zoning work as much because we have grants to do this work. For the affordable housing piece in particular, James Pappas is on our call, and he actually, helped lead an effort called the Affordable Housing Leadership Council with the city, where we convened a range of philanthropic and affordable housing development partners to basically identify, how are we going to work towards our affordable housing goals. So of that 82,000 units, I think it's 46,000 units. The goal is that they would be affordable to low and middle income residents. And so it's a huge challenge. It's, I think we right now have a lot in our pipeline because we have had, funding measures in the past, like bond measures. And then also one of the key ways we fund affordable housing is through market rate development through our inclusionary housing requirements. And so a lot of what we have in our pipeline now is based on, projects that came online, several years ago and paid fees. And then now the city is spending the fees. But in particular, with seeing that our housing pipeline as a whole has steeply declined, that will impact funding going forward, which is why we really need things like the regional BAFA bond.
Only because his name has come up twice, James Pappas, in the spirit of full disclosure, even though it's spelled the same way, that we are not relations, and I will be meeting him for the first time at noon today when he is hosting another webinar.
Wonderful.
My dear friend Veronica Shepard asks, will these slides be shared? Yes, they will be shared. You'll be getting the recording link by day's end today, and a link to those to the slide deck will be included. So Veronica, rest well on this. Cynthia Joe also, she makes a statement here, and I think it's an important statement to keep in mind, and I'll let you all respond to the statement. It's not in the form of a question. Keep families in the city with affordable housing. We are closing schools due to low child enrollment. Any thoughts on that? It's I think we're all singing from the same hymnal on that.
Yeah. I'm a mother to two young kids. My oldest is starting kindergarten this year. So this, this comment really definitely hits home for me. I think that is part of our goal is to, as we've been saying, having more people in our community can add to the overall vibrancy of our neighborhoods. And I think definitely having more housing that is welcoming to families is a part of that. So in past planning efforts, we've done things like included a requirement for family-sized units. So, two and we call it like a bedroom mix requirement. A certain percentage of your new building has to include units that have 2 or 3 bedrooms, for example. Making sure also that these buildings have on-site open space, so things like courtyards and other things like that for families to use. So, and then I think a big part of it is what we've been talking about is building housing on the west side of the city where we already have very high-performing schools. So, getting the most out of those resources and making sure we have more families that can take advantage of these wonderful schools.
And it gives them an incentive to stay, yes. From Nancy, how will you assure that more housing is more inclusive? Hold on, we just got another question, so I lost this one. Is more inclusive rather than just more choices for the middle to the rich class?
Mm-hmm.
I think you kind of answered it, but why don't you reiterate?
Yeah. So it feels like the word market rate is kind of like it's become a bad word, but it's really what we're talking about here is mixed income housing, right? So in San Francisco, we are lucky that we have inclusionary housing requirements. There are many cities in California that don't require affordable housing as part of housing development. But we have, basically our requirement is right now is 15 to 20% of affordable housing units need to be affordable to low and middle income families. And then, of course, we also have 100% affordable housing buildings. So we collect funds, and raise funding for those. And then, as I mentioned, kind of these state density bonus laws are aimed at increasing affordability even more in some of those projects. So, this isn't, exclusively condos for the rich that we're talking about here. This is, we're trying to build housing for the full income needs in our city.
Sandra asks, how do you define affordable housing? What about deeply affordable housing for those with very low incomes? Yeah,
this is a huge challenge, and actually James James Pappas from our team could speak to this more. But it is really a challenge because there are people, for example, seniors, that's a growing segment of the population where they're on very fixed income. They often are too low income to be considered low income in some of these housing developments. So the city does have things like subsidy programs. There's a senior housing subsidy program, but we need to continue to, advocate for funding for these types of programs because they don't meet the needs. There's more demand than there is supply of those programs. So it's, I think it's an ongoing challenge. It gets back to just our larger funding needs. But in terms of, just really making sure that these communities are inclusive, I think another piece of it that we've heard is, it's not enough to just build a housing. It's that we really do need all the services so that people feel like they are part of these communities and, that they can access, things like job training or, other social services or things like that in these neighborhoods.
When I began this work 18 years ago, Fred Blackwell, who is now at the San Francisco Foundation, our funder on this, but at that time he was looking at the outmigration of the African American community. And Veronica comes back and asks, "I'd like to know more how the San Francisco Black African American Faith-Based Coalition can be closer involved in the decision-making progress as this moves forward." And being, after Juneteenth, this is probably a very timely question to ask.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And this definitely came up in our outreach. We would be happy to, come to your group and have another meeting to dig deeper into any of these topics. I think, there's opportunities for engagement now as the rezoning is being, refined and adopted. And then there's going to be opportunities when we start implementation, right? So actually, when we, get to the point of, trying to build housing on some of these sites, we want to be involved. So yeah, that's, thank you for that question.
We still have a few more, and I don't want to tax your generosity of time, but they're important questions, and I'd like them to be, your responses to be archived here. So if we can maybe just go through them quickly, that would be great. What is the best way for a religious site to engage the rezoning effort to best achieve their housing goals?
Mm-hmm. So we are in this process of refining our zoning map, the draft map that we showed. And so we would love to hear from people if there are specific sites that we haven't included. Our focus has mostly been those commercial and transit corridors, but we know that there may be sites that are more kind of embedded in the neighborhoods off those streets too. So if there are specific sites that people are interested in, please reach out. And we just also we really value hearing people's kind of reactions and opinions and what this housing would mean to them. I think that's part of it too, is just hearing kind of how people value housing and then also on the other side, a lot of what we're trying to do is plan for the housing and then also think of any unintended consequences, right? So for example, we've heard from a number of people about, the potential for for residential displacement, right? So thinking about our tenant protections, that's exactly the feedback we want to hear, because then we can try to plan around it.
Thank you. And David, if you ever want to chime in, please, I just want, don't be shy, okay? To what extent is the rezoning looking at religious sites, and how can we align to achieve optimal housing goals?
David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so well, throughout the process, as we've been looking at the corridors and focusing on where we can increase sites, it's been part of the process, and it has been as we've gone corridor by corridor and seeing where these sites are. And as Lisa was mentioning, that process started long before, during the housing element, and has informed where we are. And I think just as we're talking now, if you see the map and see where kind of what's designated right now, and say, hey, actually, we would love some more height here, or we would love to explore what this means to say that us, with 65 versus 85 feet mean, or maybe we're not in the rezoning area and still want to talk about it. And that's a little bit of the work that with my colleague James Papas, who has been mentioned many times today, but that's exactly what we're doing now, is thinking as we continue to work specifically for affordable housing and beyond only our well-resourced neighborhoods, but looking at the whole city. It's thinking, how can we continue to do that work and continue to work with relationships that you all have already made, and the capacity that you've had built as a network, with SF Planning, but also with other city agencies. So we're at that moment now. So please continue the conversation. Please be in touch, and we're looking forward to more collaboration.
My dear friend Roma Guy offers this: the homeless people ready to move into permanent affordable housing, but you focused on teachers first. First responded with the fantastic, but are formerly homeless living in transition housing. I'm not. Let's try this. They're homeless people ready to move into permanent affordable housing, but you focused on teachers, I guess first responders, with which is fantastic, but are formerly homeless living in transition housing in consideration. Did you get that?
Yeah, and I think we understand, Roma, and thank you for bringing that up. We do know that the spectrum of housing needs is great, and especially even more urgent with people who are experiencing housing insecurity, have been unhoused, or who are currently in transitional housing. And that's, I think, what we're looking to provide, that whole spectrum. From our perspective on the rezoning, it is creating a larger pool of housing to meet the full spectrum of needs, but that doesn't take anything away from the urgency felt there. And there's other strategies that are being taken on by other departments in the city, more focused specifically on the unhoused populations and communities throughout.
Thank you. I was so glad that you raised the issue of SB4. It had 3 iterations, and before it even had a bill number, the San Francisco Interfaith Council endorsed it, and it was at St. Mark's where we celebrated its passage and signing. And St. Mark's Place and Ella Rolfe is a project near and dear to our hearts. We are supporting the leadership over at St. Mark's on this, and have become very active advocates for it. We have a question here. What are the expected impacts of SB4? How does that intersect with the rezoning and our housing elements goals?
Yeah, this would be a great question for our housing implementation team. So we have a team that kind of part of their scope is really to work with sponsors to interpret this kind of maze of state programs So I think the answer is that it's going to be very site specific. There's going to be sites for which maybe SB4 is, kind of the right pathway, or maybe there are sites where it's actually using SB35 or SB423. So I think it really depends on the site and then kind of the program that they're trying to develop, whether it's 100% affordable housing or it's mixed income housing. So I think it really depends. But I think it's just kind of part of this larger landscape of many different programs that we're trying to bring online to support kind of this full range of housing, as David mentioned.
We've come to the end of our time, but I just want to say thank you to the both of you and to the San Francisco Planning Department for your partnership and your investment of time here. You are now part of our history, and this program, I am praying that those who are watching and those who will watch will share it with their leadership teams that are contemplating housing. I think projects like Park Presidio United Methodist Church incentivize other congregations to take that leap, and we've done everything we can and will continue to encourage congregations to be part of the housing solution in San Francisco. Know that you have allies and that we are here to partner with you moving forward. So thank you so much. We want to thank all of those who attended virtually, and once again, ask you to share this information with your congregations and teams that are out there, and to stay tuned for future programming. This brings to a close today's programming, and we wish you a beautiful, beautiful day. God bless you and God keep you.